Hi, it's Mike Stevenson here. In today's video, we're going to be talking about a question that came up at the Integrate Summit a couple of weeks ago when I was chatting to some BizTalk users about migrating to Azure, and they wanted to talk about the scatter gather pattern and how best to implement that in Azure. And I thought the conversation we had was really interesting, so I wanted to do a little video about that. So before we jump in, um, I want to just do a quick shout out because Turbo 360 support the channel here. And one of the things they announced at the Integrate Summit is they've got a really great offer available for BizTalk 360 customers and Turbo 360 system integrator partners who are helping customers to migrate from BizTalk to Azure. So I think that offer is particularly interesting if you're in that scenario. So feel free to reach out to the Turbo 360 team to find out more about how their accelerator can help you. Now back to today's video. So if we have a think about the scatter gather pattern that this customer had implemented, so we've got an application over here. So let's say it's a web application, and it sends a message to BizTalk, and then we're going to implement one message coming in. It's going to query lots of different systems looking for I guess maybe quotes or something like that's probably a good idea. It's going to gather up all the responses, so there could be a varying range of responses, and then they'll be bundled up and returned back to the client. So there's a couple of things in this architecture that are going to be really interesting. So the first thing is from the application outside, how do you get to BizTalk? So they probably have a bunch of DMZ type activity here. And then in their BizTalk group, they're going to have a bunch of servers that'll be IIS servers with BizTalk on. And we'll have the HTTP adapter here. And this is going to be a two-way request response port. So the message is going to come in, and it's going to hit the message box over here. And then what's going to happen is a couple of things. And how you implement this at this point is going to vary slightly, but I'll go through an example of one of the ways you might. So what will happen is you'll have an orchestrational kickoff, and that orchestration might transform the inbound message to a canonical schema, and then it might drop it back to the message box, which is going to concurrently kick off all these different ports that'll call out to different systems. So in the example here, I've got three, but if you imagine, it's common for customers to have it. They may have like 100 different applications they integrate with or business partners, and that number may increase over time. So if you imagine, let's say in this case, we ping out these messages, and then each send port from BizTalk will call a different system or third party. So we'll say we've got third party 1, 2, and 3. And then each of these parties will reply back with some data that'll be routed back to the message box, and it'll go back to this orchestration. And basically the orchestration is going to bundle up all the responses that come back. Now, when you do this kind of pattern, you're going to have to have some kind of like timeout threshold here, because let's say we've got these 100 sort of target systems that we're querying data from. It's probable that all of them won't reply within an allotted amount of time. So let's say the orchestration waits for 10 seconds. Everybody who replies gets bundled up. Anybody who doesn't gets left. And then that'll basically route it back through, and the call will return right back through to the original call and application. So in BizTalk, this is it's a good pattern, this, because one, it's relatively complex and interesting, but two, over here you often would have a very plug and play like architecture where you can drop in new applications without having to rewrite all of this stuff to the left of that line, which is really cool. Now the question at this point becomes, how do we start migrating this off BizTalk to Azure? And one of the challenges is when you've got a large number of ports like this here, it's going to make the project very difficult if we have to big bang them all in one shot. So if we can do some kind of phased migration, that's going to really help de-risk, and we can take baby steps working towards through a transitional architecture towards our target. So let's have a look at what that might look like. So step number one is, let's leave BizTalk for now to be very much the same as what it is, and let's get our first Azure component in this architecture. So what I've chosen to do over here is I'd add API management in front of BizTalk. So we'll get this transition of the source application migrated over to call API management, and then API management's going to forward messages into BizTalk, and everything in BizTalk really just stays exactly as it is now. Now, there's a couple of key things here. So number one, we get our first Azure component in the architecture. We don't really have a huge amount of risk because we haven't started changing BizTalk yet, but we can deal with all of the challenges working with these applications. You know, in this case, I've got one, but there might be 30 plus applications over here who all consume this API. So we're going to have to do some work migrating them from calling BizTalk directly, maybe through a DMZ, through to API management. So we can focus on getting that done first. But the other really great thing in this step is API management here creates this abstraction where the client applications now depend on API management, and everything over here we can now start changing. And as long as we adhere to the contracts and the behavior expectation of those clients, we can actually start changing the components around. And we've kind of already dealt with any dependencies on the original calling applications in step one, which I think would be a really good move. Now, again, this step here probably isn't too complicated either. The only real bit of complexity here is going to be on this line, so there might be some networking we need to do for API management to allow it to reach BizTalk, so we can do VNet integration potentially there. Now, step two is where we're first going to start changing BizTalk. So what I'm going to do here is behind API management, I'm going to add a function and I'm going to add service bus. And then I'm going to make a change over here to BizTalk to use service bus for the inbound connectivity instead of HTTP. So what will happen is the message will come into the function app, and then we're going to send a message to a topic with a session ID. And what that means is, as we start transitioning the architecture, we'll be able to start doing pub sub from this topic, and we'll when any responders who come back with a response message, we'll have them hit this response queue here, where the function, you know, it'll basically send to the topic and it'll start listening on this response queue for a period of time. It'll collect up all of the response messages, and then it'll batch them all back together, and then it'll return that response back through APIM. Now, we're going to have to, in BizTalk, we're going to have to convert to use the service bus adapter. So that'll be a one-way adapter, and this will actually be a send port here back through the BizTalk adapter to the response queue. And the key thing we need to do is we need to flow the session ID from the inbound message back to the response queue so the right function gets it. Now, I think at this point, all of the rest of the stuff to the right of this line probably stays the same at this point. We're really just, you know, this orchestration is probably going to fire off the message in the message box. There might be a small tweak depending on how our correlation's been configured, but if needs be, we can just put a proxy in BizTalk with another orchestration in front or something that handles that. And our messages going back, and that really gets us this bit up here for the functions and the service bus, which is really a building block for the things we're going to do in the next phase. What we really want to do is we want to run Azure and BizTalk side by side for a period of time. Now, if you remember here, the key thing is that we may have 100 of these applications we're integrating with, so we don't want to necessarily do them all at once, and that'll let us do a phased approach to this migration. So the next phase after that is we're going to migrate our first target application. So everything here is kind of the same at this point, but we've put a new queue that subscribes to this topic, and we've basically added a logic app here that's going to call out to some interface, some third-party system to get the data, and it's going to basically process it, map it to that target format, and then it's going to send a response to the response queue here. And what that would allow us to do is that will let us take out the first one of these send ports in BizTalk. And that would be our first end-to-end we fully have in Azure. But at this point, because we've still got messages coming into BizTalk down here, and because the function app really bundles up all of these responses to create the response for the caller, we should be able at this point to run BizTalk side by side. And what I'm basically going to do is I'm going to try and migrate these ports out to Azure. And at this point, I think once we've got this pattern working, we can then start kind of ramping up the development. So we might have different developers work on different ports, and maybe each week or so we can swap a new one in over to the new architecture. So as we roll through that, what we'll eventually end up with is down here we've completely got rid of BizTalk. After we've been through all of these, and we've ended up where the topic routes to these queues. They trigger either a logic app or a function app. So, I'm thinking in different teams might specialize in different technologies here, or different target applications. So if you think we're integrating to these interfaces out here to get the data, each of these components here can be written in the appropriate technology for what they need to integrate with, and this will work really well. And all we do is we just keep plugging on a new queue that subscribes to the topic. We plug on a new processing component, and then whenever these components are done, they all route their messages back to the response queue, where the function that we wrote in the first place bundles them up and returns the call through APIM to the caller. So at that point, we just phased migrate through all of those send ports, doing the migration. We can then get rid of this entire integration out of BizTalk, and we've hopefully taken quite a low risk approach to migrate what was quite a complicated BizTalk interface. Now let's think about what some of the benefits we've introduced as we bring Azure into this equation. So one of the first ones is this burst scaling. So we may have applications sending us hundreds of messages coming in. And one of the big challenges with BizTalk is you're going to have to scale your BizTalk group for max load. It's not easy to dynamically add and remove BizTalk servers to your group. With logic apps and function apps, API management, you've got much more capability to dynamically scale on demand, so we can take advantage of things like elastic plans and stuff like that, and the environment will grow and shrink based on usage. The other big win should be that we should get higher throughput and we should get lower latency. So because of the burst scale, and we should be able to get good throughput. Things like service bus function apps and logic app standards should be getting better throughput than what BizTalk was getting, because we haven't got the message box latency in the middle. So that should improve our end-to-end latency potentially, where we've got less things waiting in BizTalk for responses coming back. We can potentially get responses back quicker. The big trade-off as well is going to be that in the Azure environment, because we can burst scale and not be scaled permanently for max load, we should be able to have a lower cost of ownership running this solution. It might be that there's more components that are doing, or smaller components doing a job or a specific task, rather than one big group where sometimes it might not be being used much at all, at other times it'll be really heavily used, but you can't inflate and deflate dynamically. I think the other thing I really like is this plug-and-play architecture. So with those queues and those functions and logic apps, we were just dropping in new subscribers repeatedly as we migrated the integrations across, and then in the future we can follow the same pattern. So I really like that for this architecture. And then I think the approach we took with the transition architecture supports a phased migration rather than a big bang. So we dealt with our highest risk thing at the start, which was moving the client applications off directly hitting BizTalk to going through API management. And then we could migrate components in a more controlled manner, mitigating the risk of problems for our consumers that would create problems for the project. And hopefully we just make it much easier to do the migration with a lower risk approach. I hope this video's been useful for people. Thank you for listening today and have a great week.